Actually, it's very unfair, Tim, that you presented such a nice videos just before my talk, because now nobody is going to be interested in whatever I'm going to explain. So actually, next time I'm going to bring nice videos as well to compete. So coming again to other fish, here essentially what I want to talk today is about why certain fish live alone or live together, and particularly because we have seen that there is a lot of fish species that show a wide flexibility in the grouping behavior, and that is essentially to optimize the relative costs and benefits of living in solitary or living in groups. And essentially one will start why they live. For a start, one will think that living alone actually is better because they don't have as much competition, interest-specific competition. So you would expect that they have less competition for resources, which can be food or mates or whatever, space, no? But living together also has some benefits. And it has seen that in predation, of course, can be a very positive way of avoiding predation, but also in birds, in lots of animals, has been seen as a way also to find food. So if you are in a group, you may have more chances to finding food. So, and of course, when the grouping of species is also an important ecosystem modifier, its decisions can have serious implications for how and where its function is distributed. Of course, if you have a species which is really important as an ecosystem modifier, if they go with groups or if they go in a solitary way, they can have strong implications. So what I'm going to present today is just the shoaling behavior of the Cape Mediterranean herbivore fish, which is Sarpa salpa, and its importance for their function. First of all, just want to show that actually the importance of this herbivore fish is as important as one will think about a mega herbivore. Just to give you a sense, this is a seagrass meadow of Posidonia oceanica, usually that has this height, okay? And those were cage experiments that we put for a while in an area which has a lot of these fish. And after taking the cage, just to give you a sense, outside the cage, that's all the areas which were grazed. So this fish can represent a consume of biomass of 80% of that biomass. So it actually can be really, really strong ecosystem engineer. So where, how, and what to measure. So what we did, actually, we went a little bit like Tim. What we wanted actually is to see fish. So that was the beginning. So we wanted to follow fish. The questions came after. But actually what we did was actually to follow fish groups. What we did was to jump into different areas along all the western coast of, actually along the coast of Spain. And what we did is at around 8 or 10 locations. And we did sampling of, by diving, of different groups. So our sampling unit is the shoal, and our interest was essentially to count how many individuals were in that shoal, which was the size of that shoal, and what was the behavior. So what we were doing is taking videos for 10 to half an hour, if it was possible, okay, and then we were using some analysis to do behavior with some particular programs like Boris or whatever. So at the end, we ended having about 100 videos that we could use for this study. So the first result, which we wanted to look at, is that we observed that shoals were highly size assorted. That means that essentially, if you take all the different sizes that we observe, you will have a distribution, which is this one here, okay? But what we found is that the fish were in groups depending on their size. So essentially, the small fish are with the small, and the large fish are with large fish, okay? So it shows a very clear distribution of sizes. The second thing, which was even probably more interesting, is that actually what we saw is that as individuals grow, they aggregate in larger shoals. So essentially what we saw is that for small shoals, essentially the small shoals are composed by small individuals, while the huge shoals are essentially composed by huge individuals. Okay, so really huge shoals were usually formed by really large individuals, and that, as we will see, can have a lot of implications. No? So essentially, what is the consequences? If we have these shoals, if we have an ecosystem engineer, they can be in small groups or in large groups, what consequences that would have, no? And to look at the consequences, the first thing is to look at why they fit. And what we observe as the first thing is that, and this, that was already something new, known, is that sizes of fish which are small are essentially feeding 50% of the time on algae, 50% of the time on seagrass, Posidonia, okay, Posidonia oceanica. So essentially they have, and this is known for ontogenic, I mean, you can know small fish usually they eat. Of course, if you look at the shoals, it will exactly reflect the same. But when you are in the large classes, they exclusively feed on, or almost exclusively feed on Posidonia. So large shoals also feed on Posidonia. So here we have an example of salpa feeding on algae, and as the salpa gets larger, they start to feed essentially on Posidonia exclusively. The most interesting thing actually is the type of feeding behavior that we observe, and that's actually something that we observe in this study. No? So if first of all, in the behavior, what we observe is that there were 3 types of feeding behavior. Okay, one which we call total, which means that all the group is actually feeding within the meadow. So you have all the individuals at the same time feeding in the meadow. Another type of feeding, which we call partial, means that there are some individuals feeding, while some other individuals apparently are vigilant on the water column above this. The most interesting is actually this type of feeding that we call it rotational, okay, which essentially what you have is a series of individuals which are feeding while the rest are waiting up, but then when these have fed, they just go up and the other ones just return. And the interesting thing about that is that they actually don't move. So they stay in that spot, okay? And that already we can think about the consequences on the ecosystem, which are actually quite different, no? So just to give you an example with a video, this will be a typical rotational feeding. So you have certain groups that are, I don't know if you see it, no? That they are going up, some of them are going down, and they're feeding in the same spot, okay? And that can go on for as long as half an hour in that spot. So they can spend a lot of time just feeding and spending the time in a particular spot, which of course can have quite a bit of consequences on whatever lives. Interestingly, when we look at the sizes of the shoals, what we see is that the small always use the total feeding strategy. So essentially they are small, they probably prefer to be under the canopies, they are feeding as they are moving. But, when you start to go into the medium and the large, it appears already a bit of the partial. But for the huge shoals, so when you have these large shoals these shoals can be of 200, 300, 500 individuals, what you have is essentially this, a lot of this rotational grazing. So essentially, the large individuals, which are the ones that can have the highest effect on the ecosystem, are also the ones which have this strategy of feeding in one spot for a lot of time. So the next question will be, why? Why living alone or living together? So that was something that we had in our head. This is a very descriptional study. Okay, so we just went there, observed. We couldn't test anything, no? But because we had some areas which were marine protected areas, some areas which had more resources, some areas which had different conditions, we thought, okay, let's try to understand, particularly, for instance, in the large shoals, in which we can find different strategies, no? But unfortunately, what we realized is that one of the factors that could be more important, which was maybe predation or whatever, we couldn't reproduce what actually could be the predators that these fish used to have. Even the marine protected areas, they don't have anymore the predators that these fish had in the past. The Mediterranean is extremely overfished, and they don't have predators anymore. And essentially, a marine protected area is an area which has a lot of these fish in large numbers without the predators. So we left this question for later on, but actually our feeling is that the strategy itself could probably be the feeding behavior. So our feeling is that these fish, by doing this rotational grazing, which they can do with a group, what they are trying actually to do is to arrive to the base of the seagrasses. The base of the seagrasses are the ones that have more nutrients, which have a much higher nutrient content, which is quite clear, and probably it's the feeding strategy itself that probably is causing this feeding behavior. And of course, that has a lot of consequences, which we have not yet analyzed, but that's what we want to do in the next step, no? Which is trying to follow actually these shoals and see what is actually living behind, okay? But obviously, if you have large shoals, you will have a lot of patchy effect, no? And just to finish, I would like just to have and to keep this idea in mind, which is to see the seascapes as a behavioral mosaic. Often, when we talk about seascape ecology, what we are thinking is how the seascape, how the landscape actually affects the organism. And we have seen that actually that's true. Seascape affects the behavior, and as a result, you have a particular behavior. No? Here, what we see is the opposite. Actually, what we are seeing is that a behavior actually modifies the landscape in a particular way. So it's actually what we're seeing at the end is that actually the seascapes can be seen as well as a behavioral mosaics, not just determined by the landscape features, but also by the behavior features that get imposed in this seascape. Yeah, that's all. So for a field trip, that was only, we can make a nice story.
Very nice. We have time for one very quick question.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Teresa. That was really interesting. I'm wondering, do you think that this is a positive thing or a negative thing? Because we heard earlier that, you know, with the turtles grazing, it sort of opens up new spaces for regrowth for seagrass. So do you think maybe this strategy is developed and it's positive for the seagrass meadows in that way, that it allows for new growth?
Actually, with this type of meadows, there is no other species substituting. It's a monospecific meadows, so there is no substitution of a species. But actually, what we have seen with Posidonia oceanica is that it's a species which is extremely, extremely resistant to herbivory. So it can handle this herbivory quite well and even more. So surprisingly, it just gets places like that. It affects certain features. It has less reproduction. Actually, you have less flowering. Certain things, it can happen. But actually, considering that the impact can be 80% or 70% of the primary production, you would expect in the long term these meadows to disappear. But actually, what we see is that these meadows perfectly are managing with this huge. So I'm thinking that actually these meadows and probably seagrass meadows have coped with huge amounts of herbivory in the past, which allow this to be sustained.
Cool. Thanks, Teresa.